Exactly 100 years since Britain endorsed the establishment of a Jewish homeland in the Middle East. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is celebrating the occasion with UK leader Theresa May. But as they dine, protesters will gather to demand that Britain acknowledge the suffering they say the declaration has caused for Palestinians. There have already been demonstrations in other parts of the world, including, unsurprisingly, the occupied West Bank. Thousands marched through Ramallah to the British consulate. Smaller demonstrations took place in occupied East Jerusalem and Gaza. Solidarity protests were also held in countries including Turkey, Syria, South Africa, and Jordan. Now, our team at AJ Labs have put together an explainer of what the Balfour Declaration was and what it did. This is how Palestine looked 100 years ago when the British made their promise about a national home for the Jews. The UK's then Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour issued the statement during World War I. It was included in the terms of the British mandate for Palestine after the Ottoman Empire dissolved. The mandate allowed for Jewish immigration from Europe to Palestine during the 1920s and 30s. Jews made up a third of the population by 1947. A year later, the mandate ended, the British left, and the State of Israel was proclaimed. What followed is known among Palestinians as Nakba, or the catastrophe. Zionist military forces expelled 750,000 Palestinians from their homes as they captured most of the country. Let's go straight to our correspondent in Ramallah in the occupied West Bank, Harry Fawcett. Harry, the Palestinians view the Balfour Declaration as a historical injustice. How has the day been marked in the Palestinian territories?
Well, as you might expect, it's been marked largely by protest across the occupied West Bank in cities up and down the entire territory. There have been protests. Here in Ramallah, there was a march to a British cultural centre by many hundreds, many of them young school children and students. In Gaza as well, there have been protests. In occupied East Jerusalem, there was a delivery of 100,000 letters from students to the British consulate there expressing their feelings about the legacy of the Balfour Declaration. And we've had a statement from the Palestinian President, Mahmoud Abbas, in which he called for an apology for the recognition by Britain of the State of Israel, and as well as that, compensation to the Palestinian people, compensation in terms of material compensation, political and moral. And so that is the message that's coming from here. Whether it will change anything as far as the British government's policy is concerned is doubtful. Britain continues to express pride in its role in the creation of a state, a homeland for a persecuted people, as the British Foreign Secretary wrote just a few days ago, while also restating its support for a two-state solution. But historians differ as to the decisive nature or otherwise of the Balfour Declaration and the creation of the State of Israel. What is clear, though, is the differentiation that there was in its language between the Jews who were promised a national home and the Palestinians who weren't even named, and only their civil and religious rights were supposed to be safeguarded in the event. They weren't. The Palestinians still living this history very much in present day 100 years later. Yeah, and we'll be exploring the historical legacy a little later in the program. Harry Fawcett in Ramallah, thank you very much for that. Let's cross over now to Barnaby Phillips in London. Barnaby, protests in London as well, but also celebration later.
Well, for the British government fully, this is a very delicate diplomatic situation it's in, and I think it's captured in the phrase of one Foreign Office minister today, who said that Britain will be marking, I stress, not celebrating, the Balfour Declaration with pride, but also with a degree of sadness. Sadness because the British government acknowledges that so much remains unresolved. Certainly, for the Palestinians, the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu has been invited to Downing Street and there will be a big dinner in London tonight is an insult. But the fact of the matter is that the British government is proud of its friendship with Israel. It sees its alliance with Israel as extremely important to its strategic interests, whilst it does remain committed to the idea of a two-state solution. And government sources are telling us that Theresa May will try and use tonight's dinner to press the Israelis in particular on the question of further building of illegal settlements in occupied Palestinian land. Now, whether they'll have any success or not in that regard is a different matter. Of course, the reality is that Britain was a preeminent global superpower 100 years ago, and it doesn't have that sort of influence anymore. There are dissenting voices within the governing Conservative Party, and certainly on the opposition benches in the Houses of Parliament behind me, who would like to see a more radical change in British policy. The opposition Labour Party arguing that now is the time for Britain to recognise Palestine, and that would in some small way, the Labour Party argues, atone for the legacy of the Balfour Declaration. But that is not official government policy at this point in time.
Barnaby Phillips outside the Houses of Parliament in London. Thank you very much for that, Barnaby. Let's now bring in our social media producer, Andrew Chappelle. What's the conversation online? I imagine a lot of people talking about this story.
Sure, and with stories like this, I usually go to an advanced search feature on Twitter, plug it into local trends. But if you happen to go on and you search for Palestine, you end up having a bit of an issue. Even if you type in the occupied West Bank on Twitter's regional trends, it still doesn't appear. This is despite the fact that nearly 3/4 of countries worldwide now recognize the state of Palestine. So in Israel, at least, however Twitter is defining it, several of the top trending conversations today revolve around the Balfour Declaration. Now, many people are still talking about Prime Minister May's decision to mark this centenary with pride, as she told Parliament last week. Mohammed here has one post saying that, and he really captures the sentiment of a lot of posts that I've seen today, that while you are celebrating with pride, many people are still feeling pain. Now, earlier in the day, there was a hashtag that was trending in Israel, hashtag Make It Right, and it was trending throughout the region. The Palestine Liberation Organization was one group that used it to say that the declaration can still be made right with some amount of humility and courage. A similar message from Salam here. He lives in Ramallah. He's directed those comments specifically to the British Foreign Office and the Foreign Secretary. Now, others are using this hashtag to direct their criticism at the Palestinian leadership to make it right by accepting Israel's existence. That post here from Avi Meyer, he's a former spokesman for the Israeli army. So lots of comments there. We want to hear from you as well, so be sure to send us your thoughts. You can tweet me directly. I'm at Andrew Chappelle, or just use the hashtag AJ Newsgrid.
Andrew, thank you very much for that. Now,